So we're coming together today to talk about the idea of trauma, which is not new, and anybody who works in an area that provides social services, support, or education knows that. And many of the traumas that we have seen as providers and educators up until this spring have had to do with community-based traumas, family-based traumas, individual and more personal traumas that children and families are facing. But we are in a new era where, in addition to those really important traumas that you identified in the poll having to do with parental incarceration, poverty, transition, divorce, violence, things like that, we're also now experiencing a collective trauma together in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic, locking down schools, which has, as we know, made people feel more isolated, made it harder to identify children and families who might be in need of more support. And then there is a growing sense, in addition to the challenges that have been posed by the pandemic and the lockdowns and the shutting down of schools, by the social unrest, the fight for racial justice and equity, and a growing attention on the systems that we have all been working within that have been unhealthy or led to more disparities among the people that we're serving. There are, in terms of a collective trauma, differences in the way that families and communities cope. And we are often thinking about the needs, the mental health needs of our students and our clients and our children, but those kinds of traumas and the emotional needs that our children have also exist within our families, our own families and our staff. And so the trauma that we're experiencing is something that we're all having more and more experience with. And now we're in the position of dealing with our own collective trauma, as well as helping to support the trauma recovery of our children and the people we're serving. So obviously, for many of the children and families that we're serving, school has been the place where children are identified for additional support, families might be engaged, and where there is often a greater willingness and awareness of how to identify children who might have experienced trauma, and then how to help children recover. Coming back to school, we all know has been fraught and really, really challenging, both as educators, not knowing what that might look like, and for those of us who are parents, trying to juggle our own, trying to educate our children while trying to work within schools and figure all of this out. So we're all dealing with a lot of really difficult things as we are thinking about returning to school. And that goes the same for community providers and those of you who are working in community agencies. So we at the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative have developed a toolkit to help support schools as they think about reopening. And for many of you, your plans are already set, but I know, at least from my own experience down here in Connecticut, those plans could change at any moment. So in that toolkit, which is available through our website, and you'll be able to download and have access to that at the end of this if you haven't already seen it, we focus on 7 strategies for helping schools and students transition back into whatever school looks like. And that includes fostering safety and equity, building community, working with community partners, not going it alone, acknowledging and addressing the grief that people are experiencing, reestablishing routine and connection, using mindfulness to teach self-regulation at home and at school, helping all of us learn strategies to help manage our social and emotional needs, and creating a hopeful vision for a better future together. So within that toolkit, we give some very concrete strategies about how to address those 7 strategies.
Thanks, Martha. And we'll be talking now about the neuroscience of trauma, one of the really important things to think about as we go back to school this fall. Because as we know from the COVID-19 pandemic, no one is immune to trauma no matter where you live, and the stress has definitely been affecting all of us. And it's important to remember that the stress and trauma affects not only behavioral, but also emotional well-being. And these things can result in decreased learning, which is why we're talking to educators about this today. And trauma touches a lot of children. About a quarter of children who enter school have experienced some trauma, whether that is physical or sexual abuse, neglect, natural disasters, leaving war or violence in their communities. And this really does contribute to developmental delays in terms of cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and educational. And we'll talk about how that affects lifelong trajectories as well. Oh, so this was supposed to be a little animation, but popped up all at once. So trauma is something that happens too much, too fast, or too soon. It's just too something for the body to handle. And that affects the central nervous system. And it can result in a smaller prefrontal cortex, which really affects executive functioning skills, which are those really important skills that help kids make decisions or focus on the most important information. So this is where we can see some academic effects. Trauma also overstimulates the amygdala, which causes a hair trigger response to the fight, flight, or freeze response. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another effect is that it makes the hippocampus underactive, which makes it a little more difficult for kids to remember the most important things, again, affecting academic achievement. Another effect is a disruption in the vagus nerve, which we're gonna really get into in just a moment, but this helps regulate the entire body. So this can be a really huge contributing factor to behavioral problems. But luckily, we also know from the science that yoga, breathwork, and meditation have all been shown to have positive effects on the central nervous system. So when you implement these types of things regularly, you can see increased executive functioning skills. And the research shows that for populations that have the biggest deficits, these increases are most beneficial for them. Yoga, breathwork, and other mindfulness practices have also been shown to regulate the amygdala and the vagus nerve, as well as make the hippocampus function more properly. But we also know that trauma and stress doesn't just affect the students, it affects the teachers as well. And Chris, Martha, and I and some of our colleagues, we did a report in the summer about how COVID-19 specifically was impacting teacher stress. And we know that even before the pandemic, teachers reported much higher levels of stress than people in other careers. But we definitely saw from some focus groups that we conducted that teachers were under enormous amounts of pressure and stress during the beginning of the pandemic. But school leaders really did find ways of coming back to their own self-care practices and the resiliency skills that especially the group in the CTLC that we had been working with, they talked about how important it was to come back to those self-care and community care skills. And the teachers in their schools really told us how much they appreciated the leadership of school leaders that made time for those moments. And it's also really important for us to remember that equity is a part of addressing trauma, because we have to think about how different communities were impacted by COVID in different ways. And using trauma-informed practices might be a way to make schools look more equitable when children finally return. So let's talk about how toxic stress affects the brain. When you have stress that occurs over and over, the body is not able to release those toxins, and they start to affect not only physical well-being, leading to increased sickness, but also mental well-being. Anxiety increases, it's more difficult to focus, and the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome starts. And we have a list here of some of the ways that you might see this trauma show up in your classroom. It would be great if you put some of the things that you're seeing in your classroom in the chat. Also, I put a link earlier in the chat to a participant's guide. That's a great way for you to take notes, and this graphic is in that guide, so you can take a little notes on that. But we definitely see trauma coming out in what some would call quote unquote disruptive behaviors. And a lot of adults think of this as a child looking for attention, when really they're looking for a connection. We often punish these behaviors when really they are a response to trauma. So one thing that we can do when we go back to the classroom is have a little compassion for our students and ask ourselves why they might be exhibiting some of these behaviors. And we'll give you some tools a little later to address them in a more compassionate way, rather than sending them to the principal's office, which if you're doing online learning isn't an option anyways. So that all-important vagus nerve, why is it so important? Well, this actually helps regulate the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's a really central nerve that goes from the back of the brainstem and weaves all the way down your body, hitting all of your major organs, including the heart and the stomach. And it's responsible for finding a balance, not just physically, but also emotionally. And so when animals have the fight or flight response, we never see animals experiencing PTSD. That's because they always complete that stress response. They always release the stress. And how they do it normally is shaking. They shake their body. And that actually works for humans as well. One way to reset the vagus nerve is shaking or dancing. And that's a great thing I used to use as a kindergarten teacher. I used a lot of dance parties. Another is breath work, laughing, and maintaining a healthy gut, paying attention to what you're eating. All of these things are really important for resetting the vagus nerve, and a few things that you can do in your school to just bring everybody back to that state of calm. So now we are going to put a link to the UCLA COVID-19 screener for children and adolescents into the chat. We're just going to have it up here. And you can, right now, read these questions and add together the numbers. And at the end, we'll talk about what these numbers mean. So we have gotten a lot of questions about screening when we go back to school. And every school needs to make their own decision on whether they have the staff capacity to screen their entire school, or whether it's certain populations that it makes sense to screen. We know a lot of children are going to come back from this experience with some anxiety, but there will be different levels of anxiety, and a screener like this is a quick, easy way to see who might need a little extra attention. So we're going to go into a breakout room for just a few minutes to answer a few questions. We'll give you another 30 seconds to read these questions and jot down your answers. And in just a moment, you'll be invited to enter a breakout room.
And facilitators, I'd like you to remember that really we're just going to see, what do people think about these questions? Do they fit? And what are the implications for your students? Which ones are you most concerned about? Would a tool like this be useful? So those are the sorts of questions that we will discuss in the breakout room.
So if you'd like to share your answers in the chat, the first question again was, would this be a valuable tool to administer to students? And another question was, how do you feel taking this, and what do you think it might be like for your students to take it? So there's another part to this screener, and just take a moment to read some of those questions. The ones that are most interesting to me are, has a military member of your family been deployed to a place where people have this illness? There are certain populations, like military families, that do experience a higher level of trauma than other families. We have to think about the families who did not have enough food to eat in their cupboards at the beginning of this pandemic, or the children who are in homes where they're experiencing physical or emotional abuse every day. We've all experienced trauma, but some of us will come back from this experience with more trauma than others. And we should keep that in mind as we go back to this fall.
And Dana, I received one comment that I think it's worth thinking about together. The comment was that the children probably would appreciate being asked these questions. However, they might be hesitant to answer depending upon who is around.
Yeah.
So questions of safety, security, and privacy. And Dana, do you have a thought about what we might do to help kids feel safe and secure as they answer these questions?
Absolutely. That's a really great point. When doing screeners like this, they're definitely more effective when children are allowed to take them in a private place with an adult they trust. So if that's someone that they have a good relationship with, like a teacher or a school psychologist or a school counselor, that's really the best environment. If youth are older, doing it anonymously by creating a Google form is a really great idea, or just doing it pen and paper and making sure that you reassure the students that this is going to be kept private and that the only people that will see the results are themselves and the school psychologist or school counselor. And it looks like we might be able to get into breakout rooms. I think we have a couple of minutes if we do a quick one. What do you think? Okay, we could do a quick 3-minute breakout room. Ingrid, could you set that up for us? Great. So go ahead and click join breakout room now, and we'll be back in 3 minutes.